Good morning. Any excellencies who may be here, ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be with you on this very special two-day conference in memory of the great late Kofi Annan, and very lovely to see his family here today. And thank you to Chatham House and to UNA UK and also Mark Malloch-Brown from ICG for putting together this great event. So I'm Zainab Badawi, and it's my pleasure to be moderating the youthful part of this event. You know, I like to hang out with the young crowd. We're going to be talking about governance, youth, and leadership with 4 panelists representing various constituencies and various geographical positions in the world, and just really finding out what their preoccupations are and how they want to fashion the world in their own vision. Before we do that, though, however, we're going to play a short video because, of course, Kofi Annan was a great supporter and proponent of youth engagement, youth leadership, and so on. And this is an area that is very, very, very close to his heart. And we have compiled this video, which just sets the scene for our discussions. So, technical team, please play the video, and I'll be back.
I am Kofi Annan of the Kofi Annan Foundation. The young people are the ones who are going to inherit this world. Now we need to look to the next generation to carry on the fight, to really help make the world a better place to live and to be able to pass a baton on to them. What is important is that we all commit and we do our little bit. If each of us were to do our little bit, when we look back collectively, we'll be amazed at the giant and big contribution we have made.
These include poverty, unemployment, climate change, etc. But this mostly depends on the geographical area. In Europe, for example, it's mostly about climate change, whereas in Africa it is mostly about unemployment, poverty, etc.
The fact that youth usually is not anyhow limited by an official position or the work that they have done before, therefore it allows them to be faster in responding, and in many cases we've seen a number of very creative approaches, and the youth usually uses technology, which I think is one of the major assets and one of the major sort of innovations that have been that the world and the world society have seen in the recent years.
When we think about traditional spaces, I would say that European Union is one of the examples. We can see that young people are really, really, really engaging to create change. Certainly when we talk about migration, when we talk about climate change, and also when we talk about things that really matters as human rights. But then we must look also for African Union, because the African Union Youth Commission is really working hard to bring a new impactful and a new way of thinking. But not only that, they are doing like real impact things in the local spaces.
It's really promising to see so many youth advisory panels and committees and opportunities for young people to mobilise and raise their voice. But I do think that sometimes these groups can be siloed and their views sidelined. So what I'd like to see more is youth participation mainstreamed into the major policy decision-making discussions. So what that means is when there is a boardroom full of senior decision makers who are discussing policy on climate change, on infrastructure, on health, on education, there needs to be room at that table for young people to contribute their voice, because they're the ones who are going to be inheriting that policy in the very near future.
Youth basically have used social media to engage. with the issues that they think are pertinent, because this has given them a stage, regardless of age, regardless of experience, to highlight oneself on equal terms. A lot of big demonstrations, a lot of big changing movements currently in today's world have actually happened and have been permeated by the youth through social media. The Arab Spring is also one of the examples where it's actually been a massive movement caused by social media. But so the youth have used these tools to basically successfully initiate and engage with these issues.
It was a good video, wasn't it?
Yeah, really good.
Yeah. Has it left you anything to say? No. So, Alvin Carpio.
Yes.
Not Caprio. I've been trying to pair him up with Leonardo DiCaprio all morning. Alvin Carpio is originally from the Philippines but lives in London, and he's very, very active at grassroots level. And one of the things that he has done, one of the many things apart from being an advisor to an MP in London, he's also founder and CEO of the Fourth Group, which looks at issues to do with the fourth industrial revolution, you know, the implications of technology for jobs and so on, which I think you've touched on slightly in the first session. We're just going to start off by asking you all just one opening question. What are your major preoccupations in terms of local and global challenges from the youth perspective? I just want to know, you know, are they any different from the kind of preoccupations that the older generation have? Alvin.
Thank you, and first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I actually met Kofi Annan once. This was back in Davos in 2016, and I saw him ahead of me, and he seemed busy getting on with the work that he had always been doing. But I kind of squeezed in, stuck my hand out and said, thank you. And then I ran away because I was too scared to say anything else, because I thought maybe there was a big negotiation happening at that point. But he has since inspired me in many ways. First off, I was surprised that he was a similar height to me. So I felt you can be short and still be a power player in international negotiations. I've also copied his goatee and wear similar suits. But on a more serious point, Kofi Annan has, as many testimonies throughout this conference has so far said, has really challenged us to think about the global challenges that we face, not only today, but also in the next 7 and so generations. In terms of the challenges that we at the Fourth Group have been looking at, coincidentally at the time when I met him at Davos, they launched the Fourth Industrial Revolution book. And throughout history, there have been campaigners who have looked at the injustices from the first industrial revolution in Great Britain and beyond. And so to kind of say what we're doing now, we really think about the impact of technology on society. And so there's 2 things I want to leave you with. First off, it's about coming together to address these new challenges. But also, the second issue you want to really tackle is fighting nationalism. And I'll get onto that later on in the conversation.
You don't have to leave them just yet, by the way. We've only just started. OK, so nationalism and technological change impact. Thank you very much indeed, Alvin. So, Natasha Kimani is from Kenya and is a Mo Ibrahim Fellow as well as a Chatham House Fellow, a lawyer by profession. She is the communications director for an NGO called Well Told Story, and that looks at the power of the media for change and social change and political change and the impact on young people in particular. So what's the answer to that question? What's your major preoccupation?
I think for me it's unemployment in Africa, especially youth unemployment. And I met Kofi Annan when I was very young. In 2008, when he was in Kenya, I was an intern, and it was an extremely volatile time in Kenya. And he seemed to handle that situation very gracefully at a time when grace was needed in Kenya. Something of interest to note is that 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 25. Half of that population, under the age of 35, is eligible to vote, which means we're the youngest electorate in the world. Yet, unemployment is the highest in Africa. Young people are, if you read the Mo Ibrahim Index report, 60% of young Africans feel that their plights by the governments are not addressed. And the index shows that African governments have not been focusing on issues affecting young Africans. And one of the solutions that African governments do is creating youth funds. But those youth funds only account for 0.05% of the budgets. So what happens to the other 99%? Where do young people matter? And I often say, if you want to know that a government means what it says, look at its budget. That's where they mean business. So if you tell me that young people matter, but you're not budgeting for us, then we only matter in boardrooms and in conferences. But when it counts and in implementation, young people don't matter. And more importantly, young women in Africa are not represented. African governments are not responsive to their plight and their needs, and African women are not represented in governments, except
employment and governance and representation in governance. Thank you very much indeed for those opening thoughts. Hajid Sharif is from Libya and is part of an NGO called Together We Build It or Let's Build It Together. I forget which one. Together We Build It. Got it right first time.
The name after you said
Let's Build It Together.
Yeah,
it's got more of an imperative about it, hasn't it? Yeah, it's very good. And so what's your NGO is based in Libya, and it obviously is trying to deal with a very difficult situation there. So what are the local and global challenges that most concern you?
I think the most important thing to highlight is that when we talk about global and local challenges or any sort of challenge, we're not really talking about a youth issue and a seniors issue and a women's issue, etc. We're actually talking about the issue that we're all facing, that we're all living. But when we're talking about youth engagement, then we're talking about adding a perspective. I think everyone can agree that no one has the full answer, and Kofi Annan understood that very well. No one alone or a certain group of people can fix the climate change issue or can fix the peace and security issues. So when we're talking about youth engagement, we're not really talking about, there is this very special context-specific issue that affects us, only youth, but we're talking about adding the perspective of a very important group of young people within the society in itself.
Thank you very much indeed. And Anissa Taimami is Communications Assistant at the United Nations Association UK, and very talented young lady, very excellent academic credentials from SOAS and LSE and all the rest of it. So what is your major preoccupation?
Well, I never got the chance to meet Kofi Annan, unfortunately, but doing all the work with this conference and with UNA UK, I do feel like I got to know him these last few months. And I think at UNA UK, one of our primary concerns is Kofi had an amazing legacy of not only championing children, but opening the institutions like the UN to a variety of stakeholders, whether business, civil society, and the youth. And for us, we have a campaign called Together First. A primary concern for us is moving initiatives like yours and giving them that access to the space at the table where they can influence policy effectively and move beyond rhetoric and actually fulfill that part of Kofi's legacy that we probably haven't gone far enough with. And that is primarily at the global level. We see with climate change the amazing impact that youth have, mobilizing social media, like they said in the video. We want to channel that and be the advocacy branch of bringing NGOs to the table effectively.
All right, good. Okay, so a good selection there of challenges, and I'm sure you all agree on the ones that your colleagues have mentioned that perhaps you didn't emphasize. So Alvin, let's start with your ones then, because it ties in with what you said, Natasha, about employment is very, very important, obviously, as a source of empowerment and so on for young people, particularly in Africa, which, as you said, doesn't do very well there. And I think it's worth remembering, by 2050, Africa's population will have doubled, so that 1 in 4 of the people on this planet will be Africans. So they are, in a sense, the majority of the workforce in the future, and also consumers and so on. So everybody has better pay attention to the Africans. And so what can you do about technology, fourth industrial revolution, people worried about, there not being enough jobs, both at the top level and the lower income groups as well?
Of course. Last year, the Fourth Group did a global inquiry into citizenship in digital age. And we looked at 3 key questions. First off, what are citizens' rights and responsibilities in the digital age 70 years on from the Human Rights Declaration? Secondly, what is the biggest problem caused by tech? And third, what can we as citizens practically do about it? Now, for me, what was really fascinating was the broad scope of the issues that were mentioned, from addiction to our smartphones to the impact of technology in our relations with people around us. Third, around the kind of hidden problems in the economy, where we think about Amazon, we think about a huge tech company, when actually, when you look at the factories in places scattered across England, there was a story last year where a worker had to go toilet in a water bottle because they were afraid of going to the toilet, which is far away, and they wouldn't be able to match the targets for the day. So a lot of hidden issues. Of course, fourth, there's fake news and disinformation. But finally, also interesting existential threats. So the idea of lethal autonomous weaponry. Now, I think the point here is to say that the fourth industrial revolution is new and it's bringing huge, huge challenges. And it's not only going to take young people to actually address these problems, but also folk like yourself. Now, I think the difference here is that generationally, young people, I guess, tend to have a bit more time. Students are wrapped up in the idealism of being embedded in books of history and talk about how you can change the world. Whereas if you're a bit older, you might have a family, you might have interests which you're trying to protect, you might have a job which means that you're in a position where you cannot say certain things. So I think we shouldn't look at young people as this group who are future leaders, and it's a point which is always made. But today marks 30 years on from Tiananmen Square. And we had thousands of students go there to protest for democracy and for freedoms. And also we've had mentions of Parkland, Greta, Malala. These are not leaders of tomorrow, they are leaders of today. And I think the big difference is that they have a voice which not only must be listened to, but also should lead to policy changes. Because if not, then often trouble and problems happen.
So do you all agree that perhaps impact of climate change and the impact of technology on jobs and professions in the future is going to affect younger people, obviously, more than older generations? Is that something that you chat about amongst yourselves? Because obviously you're representing, you know, the youth wing here. Is it something that you say, well, you know, I don't know, is it worth becoming a lawyer? Because in future people might just get algorithms and put things through and, you know, going to dispense with my work and doctors and all the rest of it. Is it something that you all discuss and think about how the workplace and workspace is changing and what you can do about it to better meet your needs?
Yes, but we discuss it in the context of a widening gap, because the more access we have digitally, it also indicates that there are some people in rural and peri-urban areas that, especially in the African context, may not be able to access the technology or the digital data that is needed to transform their lives. So there may be a section of Africans who will move forward and the rest left behind.
That's interesting, because Kofi Annan, of course, very, very early on, alerted everybody to this digital divide, as he said, and the world will end up having the digital haves and the digital have-nots. Are we perhaps looking at a more significant division, not a youth and older generational one, but a rural and urban gap, which is actually more important than the generational one? Do you think?
If I could respond to that, there is a youth gap and there's a youth challenge. And even within the youth challenge, there's a peri-urban rural and urban youth. And even within that, there's a gender divide. So young people need to be segmented in order to address their individual issues. Because
but it's not a uniform group, is the point you're making.
Not
You've
at all.
got the urban, the peri-urban,
yes.
and the rural.
They are not
and
a
they
monolith.
may need different...
Absolutely. Individually targeted solutions.
Right, okay. Is that something you all agree with? Yes? And would it be fair to say that perhaps some of the preoccupations you have are more urban ones, or are you also in your own ways aware of what the rural populations think? Because of course they are still in the vast majority in Africa.
Well, I think with what we're trying to do with the Together First campaign is to set up a process of regional consultations. That means we can identify the most actionable policy changes. And I think that from the outset, youth is, to us, an equal stakeholder in all of this. I totally agree with what you said, that it's not as much about the youth being leaders of the future, recipients of the future. They are very much actors in the present. So we don't necessarily differentiate on a daily level in our campaign. Youth, this youth campaign, that youth campaign, we think that they should be at every table, every discussion, and they are held within equal measure in the same way that rural, urban campaigns are too. And we're hoping that through we have a global partnership already. We're working with organizations from South America to China who have that access across all of these lines. And I think one of the interesting things about youth today is that they are inherently multilateral. They are inherently aware to these intersectional ideas, and whether that is across policy, whether that is across personal issues. And that comes also from the digital language that they are so adept with, I think.
Right, okay. So want to be participants in the power structures. So, okay, let's look at that then and tell us what obstacles you feel that young people meet in trying to get through into local governance structures, national ones, and then the multilateral international institutions such as the UN, which tends to favor the older generation. You know, international bureaucracy, civil servants are, on the whole, not in their 20s or early 30s. So is that the route that you think is going to yield the greatest results, or do you think that you need to look at ways of acting such as, you know, civil disobedience campaigns like we've just seen with the climate change groups here in London? We've heard the Arab Spring mentioned. We've seen it in the Sudan. Unfortunately, it's going pear-shaped now, but predominantly young groups of people ousting, you know, a dictator who'd been around for a very long time. Is it that kind of action or the more formal structures, or both?
I think there's definitely many different quarters for where power lies and for where certain types of folk can thrive. I say that because yesterday I was mentioning to a group of friends of mine on WhatsApp, I'm going to be speaking about our shared humanity and about Kofi Annan's inspiration. And also then one of them shared a news story about Jay-Z becoming the first $1 billion rapper. And so I asked, is that the person who you are inspired by? Is it Cristiano Ronaldo? Is it Theresa May? Is it Donald Trump? Who are you inspired by? And I think the point that I was trying to get to in the question is that influence lies in many quarters. In many ways, influence has shifted from Washington and Westminster to Silicon Valley and Shenzhen. When you think about how tech companies have really influenced the way we live, work, and play. On a daily basis, you're on your phones right now, which is changing the way we're interacting even in this conference today. So I think when thinking about influence, what's really interesting from the conversation yesterday is just to talk about United Nations in the 21st century. And I think I asked them, would you actually want to be a future Kofi Annan? And actually, interestingly, they said, of all the people you mentioned, he's the biggest role model. I didn't kind of try to say that, but interestingly, you know,
not
you have
Jay-Z.
Not Jay-Z. I mean, you could be rich, but actually, in terms of role model, who you'd want to share with your kids, it was Kofi Annan. And I think the general point is that young people have many different ways to make a difference. The only thing about the UN and big institutions is that it's a bureaucracy, and there's good and bad. And actually, for accountability, you need to show you know what you're doing. The whole point of a rise in an institution is that there's checks and balances. But do we need young people in these institutions? Yes. It's about kind of being open to that possibility.
Right, very good. I hope you told them, no offence, Jay-Z, but right answer. Kofi Annan, yeah. Hajid, so you're from a country which obviously, Libya, is sadly very conflict-ridden. You mentioned how, you know, conflict resolution and peace and so on, peace building is very, very important. And of course, that was very important to Kofi Annan. He worked as a troubleshooter in so many places in the world. How do you feel? I mean, how do you feel as somebody in the NGO world? Do you feel very frustrated? Do you feel that you're on the outside, hammering at doors, trying to get in to influence change, or what?
I'm afraid if I answer this question, the real grumpy person inside of me is going to appear right now. But I think it should. to be completely honest, I'm not only frustrated, I'm seriously disappointed. I'm disappointed on the fact that, it's 2019 now, and we're still talking about the right of people to participate. We're still trying to like knock a door that is supposedly still open, you know? If we're talking about engaging with the UN, for instance, I can reference so many reports, so many Security Council resolutions, conventions, in speeches, etc., where like we don't really need to convince the UN or any global leader that not only us as young people, but the people in general that has something to say and has a contribution to do. I think it was very apparent that there is a leadership crisis, and it's really sad because I feel this is a time in history where we need to come together and we need to see role models. But the conversation you shared, I think it goes along everyone, at least in my generation and below. When Kofi Annan passed in the summer, I had few friends talking to me, and I think it was very interesting that all of them said one thing: we think he's the last leader. This is the generation that I grew up with. I was born in '92, and all of my friends, we started to believe that we lost all of them. And with all due respect, with all the global leaders, the current ones, but I mean, sorry, apart from Beyonce, I don't see anyone else. Seriously. I'm serious. I don't see anyone else. Let's leave the titles away. I mean, I remember when I was around 6, whenever someone in the house will say, do you want coffee? And then my brother will say, you want coffee or Kofi Annan? And that says a lot, because we did understand. Like, we were 5, 6, 7, and we did understand what Kofi was doing. If you go to a club nowadays, you're gonna hear the Kofi Annan song. So when I was checking in at the airport, the security guy asked me, so what are you gonna do in London? Of course. Anyways, and then I said, well, I'm here for an event to honor Kofi, and then he said, Kofi Annan, and then he said, so you work with UN? Of course, that was the question, because like, why don't you have a UN passport? And it was just so interesting that that guy still remembers Kofi Annan works with the UN. And ask anyone, I mean, you will remember Kofi Annan as the leader, as the one who really put the peace and security agenda, as the one who put the human rights agenda. Even when it comes to business and human rights, it's Kofi Annan.
But you think it's being marginalised now because there isn't one really carrying that baton?
And I don't think it's about one person who's doing this. I don't think there is anyone at the moment, whether an individual or an institution, who's really taking the step of being honest and speaking the reality and speaking the truth, you know.
At an international level, particularly. Okay.
Yeah.
So before we just go...
I'm sorry for my grumpiness,
no,
by the
good,
way,
it's
but
good.
you asked.
It's positive. I did ask. I did. Yes. No. It's very, 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 very good answer. Yes. Thank you. So Natasha, you mentioned that you work a lot with gender as well, and so when we're talking about young people trying to influence the world they live in and so on, you feel that women are even more disempowered than young men are, and that your country, Kenya, unfortunately, in terms of government representation for women is not great, unlike Rwanda, for instance, in East Africa. Any special challenges, and how do you get over those obstacles for women? And you might want to answer that too.
Well, and I'll speak about the African context, because that's what I think I'm most fluent about. There are quite a number of hurdles that women have to jump through. And in Africa, the first and most important step to be successful in politics is you have to be married. If you want to be respected, you have to be married. And not just married, but married to a respectable man. He must count for something. Second, you must have children. And, 1 or 2, 3 is good. Third, you must be endorsed by a political leader who matters. And I'll give you an example. If Prime Minister Raila Odinga endorsed me, I wouldn't even need to campaign. I'd literally be elected in my sleep. If you're a single woman running for office in Africa, you will have the hardest time, because it will become about who you are in your private bedroom. it will become not about your policies, but about what you could do, how pretty you are, what shoe you fit in, what shoe you don't fit in, how you looked in a particular dress, and whatever your political ideology is, for example, about Theresa May, I don't think a man would handle the job that she handled. And the flack that she's gotten, I don't think a man would have gotten the same. Now, if she was in Africa, my goodness, there'd even be a rap song about her. And Twitter would be going off. So often what we found, and I'll give the African context, is girls don't want to participate in politics because it's too much. It's not worth it. So they'll just let the men do it. So the first step for me is, can we change how we think about young women? Can we change how we frame our conversations around them? When we say we want them to sit at the table, are they sitting at the table and being quiet? Or are they sitting at the table and giving meaningful interaction? Also, when they're invited into forums, you'll find that governments often invite them in forums relating to do with a policy relating to mothers and breastfeeding, a policy relating to menstrual health, hygiene. But when it comes to climate change, when it comes to foreign affairs, apparently there are no women who have a voice or have a thought in relation to that.
Do you support quota systems for women in parliament and...
That's one step.
That is one step.
But the problem also with quota systems is it's sort of like a box tick.
Right.
It's an easy option because they'll get into parliament, but they won't engage.
All right. And also in terms of the youth agenda, we're finding that the obstacle, I mean, Nigeria last year, for instance, lowered the age at which young people could stand for office. But you're saying, do you agree that you need resources to campaign and so on, and a name behind you, that acts as an effective barrier? But let me ask you this. There are those who say that even when young people become elected and they get positions of power, they start behaving like everybody else, and that they're not necessarily the visionaries who bring something different, that they just go native and, they're not necessarily less corrupt or whatever. Yeah.
I think it's a really important point to make, and we each choose the political leaders whom which we back on many different counts. For me, age is not the #1 reason as to why I'll vote for somebody. Now, if you look at UK elections, there were a higher share of young people who voted for Jeremy Corbyn, who is, well, I mean, he's not a young person, but he, by any stretch of the means, maybe young at heart, but he did look out for young people.
No offense, Jeremy, if you're listening.
Yeah. I'm sure, he will be fine with it. But he looked out for the issues at which young people cared about. Too high rents, tuition fees. So I think when it comes to leadership, it's really about what you say. But when you look at young leaders...
So it's youth-sensitive policy that's important, not necessarily who's saying it.
Sometimes, but when you look at maybe Sebastian Kurz, who of course just recently came down as Chancellor, maybe some young people probably backed his agenda, where he wanted Austria to be one of the places which kind of dealt with immigration in a particular way. But maybe in other parts, young people probably would have gone against that. And actually, they would have backed Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez or the other young generations. I think age is not the defining factor. It's about what agenda they bring to the table.
So do you all agree then that in the Kofi Annan video we talked about, somebody mentioned the point about silos and so on. So when it comes to government structures, not necessarily who's sitting at the table, but the fact that governments have to be responsive to the needs of the younger generation and have that right across government departments, not just, it's about women, so maternal health, but right across. All governments have to think about the impact on young people of these policies.
In order for that to happen, they need, whoever the leader is or the decision maker is, they need to listen to the youth voice. They need to listen to the perspective. Because as I said, I don't think it's a matter of like who can do it better. Is it the senior group, or is it the youth group, or is it the women, or which group in the society? It's more or less about the partnership. It's more or less about coming together to like tackle the issue from different perspectives. And in order to mainstream a youth perspective or a gender perspective or any sort of perspective, then we need to have different people on the table. And it's quite fascinating. I mean, if you see meetings where, you have global leaders coming together and speaking, it's quite a big table with so many empty chairs. but still there is only few men or a few men and women sitting on the table. So it's really about the systematic barrier in terms of like, who can enter this conversation? Who has the capacity? Are you experienced enough to engage in a political discussion or not? And that as well, when it comes to politics, I mean, what does a political experience mean?
Okay. So when do you take to the streets if you don't get what you want? Should you take to the streets?
Oh, well, I don't know. I think that there is never one single answer to this. I think you've explained very well how many different elements, how many different factors, and when you're going back to the question of, in terms of global governance, where are these obstacles? And I think for us, we see that the conversation on youth really, one of the biggest obstacles is the same obstacle civil society is facing across the board, and that is a shrinking space for civil society's voice. And the processes of rising authoritarianism, rising populism that threaten so many of the things that have been on discussion during this conference in terms of Kofi's legacy, that is what is pushing this squeezing of civil society access. And we would say that we cannot, the UN absolutely is bureaucratic, absolutely there are elements that need to be refined, but Kofi Annan believed in the fundamental tenets that underpin the United Nations. He was an idealist, but he was also very pragmatic. We've heard that time and time again in many different panels. And we have to be pragmatic about enabling a consistent and a legitimate voice of civil society in institutions like the United Nations.
Thank you. Let's go to the floor. Hands up. I would like to hear from some of the young people in the audience as well. I mean, no, just initially. Yes, this young lady here with the long hair, with the blonde tips, yes. And if a microphone could go to that lady, and I'll come to you presently. Any other hands? Okay, there, and there's one there and one here. Introduce yourself and your organisation if relevant. No speeches, please, just pertinent comments. Yeah, thank you.
Right, my name is Carla from the University of Essex. And my question to the panel is, so you've mentioned...
just put the microphone a bit closer.
Sorry, yeah. You've mentioned that one of the major issues for the youth is the lack of employment opportunities and also the lack of political experience. And I would like to ask for your opinion on unpaid internships, especially in foreign affairs and international relations, because that's an issue that the UN has actually acknowledged. And that's something that's really hindering the social mobility of a lot of people. So most interns today at the UN come from well-off families, which limits most of the world, really. So what is something that can be done in that regard?
Unpaid internships. Chatham House, I'm reliably informed, does not have any unpaid internships. Yes, the lady there. You don't have a microphone there. Are there two mics or just one? Yeah. Could you just give one to the... I'll come to you shortly, sir. Yeah, this
Hello.
Lady here and then there. Yeah.
Alice Fuchs, UN Women UK. I'm also a teacher as well, and I go into schools, universities, to talk about gender equality and the work of UN Women. And one of the things that I constantly come up against is that the students I talk to feel they have no place at so many tables where decisions are made. One of the things I would like the conference to think about and take away is how can you make it easier to bring younger people to, for example, the Commission on the Status of Women at New York. They seem to, at the moment, to only be able to attend if they're well off or if they go to schools that can support them. I think it would be really good to look at the complexity of getting accreditation to attend. At the moment, it's almost impossible unless you are an expert in the United Nations. If you're an outsider, if you're a school, or if you're a university club, a UN club, to try and get 4 students to the United Nations to CSW is almost impossible. So any comments you have, I'd be really grateful to hear them.
They may not be competent to answer that particular question, but thank you very much. We'll take that at least as a comment. Could you just pass the microphone to the young man there? Yes, thank you. You got it. Yeah, stand.
Hi. Thank you. I've got a question concerning what's...
Introduce
yeah,
yourself,
I'm
please.
Shao from China. I'm just reading the papers, and there are reports about what's going on in Sudan and in Algeria recently. And I don't know what's the root causes for those turbulences, because some say that the unemployment among the youth in Algeria is about 1/3. And I don't know how the international community can deal with these kind of questions.
Thank you. And then the gentleman here. Thank you. Was there anybody else? Yeah. And brief, as I said, because we've only got a few minutes. Thank you.
Ronan Tynan, I will be as brief as possible. Just first, I want to thank the panel for yet again identifying, for me certainly, what was special about Kofi Annan. I want to ask the panel then specifically about the whole issue of human rights, because one member of the panel used the term crisis of leadership. And I want to really ask, because I've been trying to figure it out over the last, what was it that was so special about Kofi Annan? But of course, he really did have a real sense of rights, because every single concern you on the panel, apart from you, Madam Chairperson, have expressed could be defined as a human rights issue. And he seemed to have that fundamental appreciation. As I think one of you said, he understood the tenets of the United Nations, and he really stood for that. And last night, I'll finish on this, Madam Chairperson, as well, because I want to ask you about how we can really get young people more focused, defining their issues in terms of human rights and really doing something about it. But last night, I asked this question, what would have been different about Kofi Annan handling Syria, for example, despite the huge geopolitical difficulties for General Secretary. And he said Kofi Annan would not have remained silent in the face of the egregious abuses being committed in spite of the politics. And I think there it is. Isn't that the real issue? Young, old, middle-aged, whatever, that if leaders are not prepared to speak out, to defend human rights, we really have no hope.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. And then if you could just pass the microphone to this gentleman here and then the young lady there, and then panel will have our closing remarks about these points. Yes, thank you.
Good morning. I assure you, Alvin, I'm very young at heart, despite my appearance. And Hajar, it's great to see you again. I loved what you said in conclusion in Geneva.
To everybody.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Ahmed Fawzi.
Yeah, we know who you are, but sorry.
And she's Zainab Badawi.
Yeah, I know, but people can't see you from the back, that's why.
Sorry, yeah. I used to work, I still do, for the UN in various communication capacities. And Hajar said at the end of our ceremony in Geneva, Kofi Annan is not the past. Kofi Annan is the future. And she got a great round of applause for that, because we all agree that is true. My question is to you, Hajar. I was intrigued by your mentioning Beyonce as the only figure you could think about other than Kofi Annan. I'm just curious, and it's a sincere question. Okay. In what way did you think of her? And Zainab, I can answer the question, if you want me to, on interns, unpaid interns.
Yes.
At some later stage, perhaps we can talk about it later.
To Elizabeth over there, yes, about internships.
No, the internships was here.
Yeah, no, but she also
that was letting people into the UN. So
yes, the unpaid internship, and that was about getting access to the UN. Yes.
The unpaid internships is a matter for member states to decide, because when you say the UN, if you're talking about the Secretariat of the United Nations, which are the four or five headquarters we have, New York, Geneva, Nairobi, Santiago de Chile, and Bangkok, we are not authorized to pay, we being the Secretariat of the United Nations, because it's not in the budget. Member states have to approve a certain amount in the budget every year for interns. This historically has never been done. Now, the agencies, funds, and programs who have more independence and autonomy, some of them can do that. ILO in Geneva, for example, WIPO, ITU. So if you're interested in a paid internship, I would advise you to choose one of those agencies, funds, or programs that budget for paid interns. On the other hand, if you want to lobby for paid interns in the Secretariat, I would lobby member states. Okay. That is the only advice I can give you. I can talk to Elizabeth later, perhaps, about
getting,
more. Could we talk about this later?
Approach.
Okay, I don't want to waste people's time.
Yeah, a more inclusive approach around the table, because that was a how question, and I think you can take that up bilaterally with Ahmed. Last point from the floor was this young lady here. Thank you.
Hi, Izzy Kuma. I asked a question at the last panel but didn't get answered, ironically, about youth. So my question is, how can we equip young people with the skills to meaningfully contribute? Not just create the forums for them to actually come to the table and participate, and not to come to the table to talk about youth issues such as unemployment and climate action, but how can we equip young people with the skills to expand their horizons to actually have a say on all issues? And the reason they may have to use social media is because that is the only space they can do that. But how can we actually equip with the skills?
Okay, very good indeed. Okay, panel, so your closing remarks then, incorporating some of the points from the floor, how can you equip young people with the right skills so they know how to take advantage of space that might be opening up or not? The gentleman there about a human rights-based approach to this whole discussion, which was championed very much by Kofi Annan. There's a question there from the gentleman from China about employment being perhaps at the core of some of the conflicts that we're seeing in Algeria and Sudan at the moment, with people marching on the streets demanding that. I think the internship thing has been dealt with, and a particular one to you about Beyoncé. So I will come to you. So your closing remarks, and remember that we are here under the umbrella of our shared humanity, exploring Kofi Annan's legacy. So Anissa from UNA UK.
Well, I think I probably have to give a broad stroke thing to answer to all of those great points. I would just say that on the human rights thing, I think that you're right, all of these issues are human rights issues, and that's why for us a huge vital thing is accountability. And I think that in the way that Kofi opened the United Nations to so many different stakeholders, that was under the belief that the multiple voices are necessary in order to allow for that accountability across these issues. And then in terms of youth, I think the youth are extremely skilled. I think that the youth at IC, our office is right around the corner from Trafalgar Square, and I saw the Fridays for Future protests, and when you see their capacity to organize, to take to the streets, to Greta Thunberg is having meetings with international leaders, I think that they are very well equipped, and actually that step up so that they can then take those skills, take that knowledge to influence policy is what we have to support, and hopefully we can do that through campaigns like Together First and all the work you amazing panelists are doing.
Thank you very much indeed. Natasha from Well Told Story.
On a light note, someone talked about political experience. I often say that a lot of politicians are just winging it. So sometimes political experience is not necessary because they're just making it up as they go. So I think it's important to not use that as an excuse to lock young people out of rooms that matter. About unemployment, I think one of the ways that African governments can begin planning for young people is actually budgeting for them. I go back to budgets because African countries have amazing policies. I think some of the best in the world, but they're collecting dust in some ministry library somewhere. So why not implement what you have? Young Africans are more educated than they've ever been. They have more skills than they've ever had. So what is happening? Why aren't we employed? Why aren't there opportunities? Is because they're not being created. So I think there needs to be some level of intentionality that this needs to happen, that this needs to change. In order for young people's issues to be addressed, we must plan for it, we must budget for it. So for me, that's a direction I would take. Secondly, I would say that it's important to note that even if there's need for civic disobedience, there must be space for it. Because I wouldn't encourage young people to protest if their lives are going to be at risk. I would say governments must also create and enable a space where young people are able to express their dissent in a safe environment. And we've seen that especially, and I will close by saying Kofi Annan did a remarkable job, especially for Kenya. And it is of note that a majority of his team was under the age of 35.
Just very quickly on employment, when you say, and picking up the point there, particularly in Africa, people say that perhaps, young people are very entrepreneurial. And then actually you talk about, having to facilitate employment, but also to facilitate the environment for entrepreneurs as well. So this idea of employment and entrepreneurship is an important one.
Absolutely.
Linking the two together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But also young people have been pushed towards entrepreneurship. And
Which can
more
be
so,
good and bad, yeah.
exactly, because more so are falling into the informal and vulnerable sectors. Yes. So that also needs to be protected.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you. Alvin?
What was your name again?
Izzy. From the fourth group, just to remind everybody, yes.
So I've got one word for you, and that's organise. It's been, if we really think about change, there was a stat recently which said that it takes 3.5% of a population for something to swing for change. And when you get organised, when you get people on the streets, look, we had a petition signed by 130,000 people calling for Google to pay the 1.5 billion tax they dodged, which could have paid for 60,000 nurses. 2 people turned up to the rally. Now, we need to really look at the limitations of technology, and actually the real heart of it is organising. So let's meet up after this and let's organise. The final point is, look, I think the quote that I remember yesterday from Kofi Annan was the vision of a mountain and we together pushing up these boulders and rocks and some potentially slipping. Now, when I think about the biggest threats to human rights, to the sense of common security and a sense of peace and togetherness, for me it's nationalism and protectionism. Now that's my personal view. And those boulders could potentially fall and mean that actually the sense of United Nations, the EU being these conduits for progress, could collapse. And so for me, I really believe that there needs to be a lot more work done, not only with young people, but people across the board, to really think about complementing national interest and taking care of people within borders with global interest. Now, all of you here, you're global citizens, but not many people out there believe that they are. And so I think the key thing for us, so that those rocks and boulders don't fall down the mountain, is to really renew the sense of global interest. And again, it's going to take us to organise to make that happen.
Thank you. And Hajer from Together We Build It, an NGO based in Libya, your final closing comments. And I think you actually worked with Kofi Annan on trying to build peace in your part of the world. So you do please share your final thoughts on what that meant for your efforts. And Ahmed Foz's point about Beyonce, maybe get rid of the Beyonce point first. Yes, is she really your role model?
Yes, you see, it's not only me, but
see her in a different light from now on.
But the answer to Beyonce's question,
yes, why?
Goes even to what I'm going to say about my experience with Kofi Annan, because what Beyonce and Kofi Annan managed to do is to be political but remain relevant to the people, is to speak about issues that maybe do not affect them personally. I mean, Beyonce is not affected by police brutality, for instance. She's not affected by gender inequality, but still she manages to go out, use her platform, instead of singing about being rich and flying in a private jet and having an island of her own, she speaks about politics. And so many people understand that. I mean, let's be completely honest. A song by Beyonce at the Louvre raised more awareness than perhaps a campaign that is funded by the United Nations that costed billions of dollars. That is the reality. And that's the thing that the United Nations need to understand, world leaders need to understand, is that you cannot tweet with the picture of a refugee and say, I'm deeply concerned. I'm deeply concerned. It doesn't work this way. It doesn't work this way. You just need to be as honest as possible. Earlier, you mentioned something I find very interesting, where you said, you know, maybe a politician or someone who has an office might lose if they speak out. I think Kofi Annan could have lost, Beyonce could have lost, but they still did it And people loved them for that, and people understood them, people believed in them on that. The leadership crisis, I'm going to repeat it again. I see it, and I think if anyone who doesn't see it with me, then they need to think again about it, because let's face it, there's so many horrible things happening around the world, and we still see the scripted speeches that is written not even by them, by their political officers, by their advisors. Every single word is like painted to mean so many different things apart from the reality and about from the truth. So why Beyoncé is my role model at this point? Because she's the only one who's speaking out. She's relevant. Many people understand what she says. Meanwhile, that's not her work, but she still goes for it. And that's something Kofi did.
Your final point, yes, and perhaps linking the human rights agenda thing, yes.
But I actually want to share something that I know about Kofi, and I said it, and talking about the interns. Kofi was very good in giving a voice to everyone in a room. In one of our meetings, and I think perhaps all of you can agree with me, usually interns have the silent mode on, you know? You are in the room as an intern, you take notes, but no one ever invites you to speak. Kofi Annan, if you are with him in a room, it doesn't really matter whether you are the head of state or you are in the intern. And I've seen so many times in meetings where Kofi will let everyone speak, and then he will turn to the intern and ask them, what do you think? So it's not only about, you know, you need to have a space, you need to do it, you have like this guidelines to follow. It's just really about being like a human being and acting like a human being, whether you are the head of state or you are the intern. And if it happens that you are the head of state or if you are running an office, then just be relevant and just speak the truth, which is not happening.
Haja, thank you very much indeed, Haja. And thank you very much indeed, panel. Slightly quizzical looks. I think the Kofi Annan family is still digesting the fact that Beyoncé may have the baton passed to her in the Kofi Annan legacy, but they're working on it. They're working on it. Yeah. They're working on it. Yeah. Okay, so we heard it here all. Thank you very much indeed to my wonderful young panel, and thank you also for your attention and your contributions from the floor. I think you'd all agree that this is not the next generation, this is the now generation, and they've made it very clear what they would like. Thank you. Lunch is served upstairs. You are due to return at 1 o'clock. Good luck on meeting that deadline, because we are a little bit late. My pleasure to have been with you. Bye-bye. Thank you.